Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well.
In his work, How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend, Plutarch is going to tell us that some flattery is not quite so easy to discern. And he says that in this work, we are in quest of the real, that is, true, alethinon, flatterer, who takes hold of the business with adroitness and skill. It's very easy to tell some people as flatterers. They're not the ones that we're most in danger from. So he says, who do we have to be on our guard from against the person who is a flatterer but does not actually appear to be so and will not admit that they do so? And he gives some examples of this. You know, they're usually sober, they're busy, they must have a hand in everything. And he's got this wonderful little quip here. They play the part of a friend. They are imitating friendship. So it's important to be able to tell flatterers from genuine friends with the gravity, he says, of a tragedian and not that of a comedian or a buffoon. And he's using the term hypokrites there. This is an actor. This is somebody who is before the judges, literally. And he's talking about three different genres of poetry. So we have, tragedy, but then we also have the comedy, and we have what's translated here as buffoon, satirikos. They had these plays that were even more ribald, you could say, than comedy, that were called satyr plays. And so Plutarch is drawing on a distinction of genres. The tragic character isn't necessarily sad or something like that, but it's felt that there's a seriousness there that's lacking to comedy or satyr plays. So we want to figure out who the real flatterer is, and so we have to be attentive to the tricks or the techniques. Actually, there is the term techne, art, being used there. And there's a number of different things that are discussed, some of which we have already addressed to some degree in other places, so we don't need to go quite so deep into analysis of all of them. So the first one that he talks about, which is quite interesting, and there's going to be a lot of discussion of it towards the end of the work, is that flatterers use a semblance of what's called frankness of speech, that is parrhesia in Greek, being clear, being honest, being straightforward with people about what it is that they're doing wrong or have done wrong, or a character trait that they need to work on. And Plutarch says people think that this is the language of friendship, and that the lack of frankness is unfriendly and ignoble. So the flatterer, who's a good flatterer, is going to use something that looks like frankness of speech, but it isn't really. And he's got this culinary sort of metaphor here. He says, just as clever cooks employ bitter, pikros, extracts and astringent, austeros, flavorings to remove the cloying effect of sweet things, so flatterers use a frankness which is not genuine or beneficial, but which, as it were, winks while it frowns and does nothing but tickle. So they're going to say negative things, but they're not going to say negative things that really hit at the core of the person's failings or defects. They will find ways to appear negative, to season it with a little bit of austerity or harshness, a little bit of bitterness, but not so much as to take away the sweet effect. So that's one thing we want to be on guard against when people are seemingly being frank with us. Are they really giving us the straight criticism that we need? Another major thing, pretending to share in similarities, whether they be of lifestyle or interests or views or values. He says, the flatterer, knowing that when people take delight in the same things, it's only natural they find enjoyment and satisfaction in each other's company, attempts to approach each victim, and they act as if they have these similarities when they don't really have them. It's a matter of imitation. So, there's different techniques that we can use to figure out whether somebody is really like us or not. I'll just give you an example from ordinary life that a lot of people, make a big deal out of. So you can get all sorts of classic metal band T-shirts. And, so let's take Iron Maiden, for example. One of the things that a lot of people do, which is kind of a jerk move, it's done for gatekeeping purposes, but it could be also anti-flattery purposes, is to say to the person, oh, you've got that Iron Maiden t-shirt? Cool. Name 5 songs that you like the best. And if they can't name any, they probably don't like that band. Now, maybe, I wear metal band t-shirts a lot, so somebody could come up to me and they could be like, oh man, yeah, I love Judas Priest, I love the Scorpions, I love Accept, pick whoever you want, and they're wearing the same t-shirt. That's trying to get an in with me. And I could actually say, oh yeah, what's your favorite album? Right? And if they say something like, I don't know, in the case of Judas Priest, I think there's a hell bent for vengeance or something like that. It could be, you're a poser. You're not really into the thing that I'm into, right? And we could do that with philosophy. Go carrying around philosophy books. Ooh, I read Plutarch or something like that because we know that somebody else is into Plutarch. So anyway, that's enough about that one. Closely related to this is pretending to share in the same sort of problems or defects. This is relatable, right? That's a term that we use in our time. So he says that flatterers will not be denied a share even in the chances of life which happen without our will. They flatter the sickly by pretending to be afflicted with the same malady and to not be able to see or hear distinctly if they have to do with those who are dim-sighted or hard of hearing, right? Some seize upon afflictions as a means to insinuate themselves even more and carry their fellow feelings so far as to include inmost secrets. And he gives examples. If your marriage is bad, somebody else is going to relate to you by talking about how their marriage or their relationship is bad. Why? Because this similarity makes fellow feeling stronger, and we think that we're connected with them. If you're in financial difficulties, they'll talk about their financial difficulties. If you've got a skin condition, they'll talk about their skin condition. Pick whatever it is that you want. So that's a similarity in the negative. And then there's a long discussion which we really need to explore in a bit more detail. So it begins with this wonderful analogy. They say the gadfly finds lodgment with cattle close by the ear. So a gadfly is what we would probably nowadays call a horsefly or a deer fly. And then he talks about ticks with dogs, right? And it is true that they often do bite near the ear because that's where the flesh is soft. So he says the flatterer takes hold of ambitious people's ears like a parasite. Now, how do they take hold of somebody's ear? They're not actually like drilling in with some proboscis or something like that. What they are doing is putting something into their ear, praise. So they latch onto them. And how do they do this? So Plutarch is going to point out a very interesting idea. When we praise somebody, we could be praising them for their action, what it is that they do, or we could be praising the person. Now, what does a person who, is really judicious and appropriate in their praise tend to praise? Not so much people. We don't know people all that well. We do know their actions. We would also praise consistently. So if we're going to praise this kind of action done by this person who we like, we should also praise this sort of action done by somebody who we don't know or we actually dislike. That's a test for telling whether you're being objective in your praising. Flatterers are going to praise the person instead. And so, he says, those who unthinkingly praise and join in applauding an act or a saying or anything offered by another, whether in earnest or in jest, are harmful only for the moment and for the matter at hand. Those who with their praises pierce to the person's characters and indeed touch their habit of mind with their flattery are doing, and again he uses another analogy, the very thing that servants who steal not from the heap but the seed corn. What does that mean? It's an agricultural metaphor. The seed corn is your store, right? The heap is the stuff that everyone can see. So they're going to steal from the stuff that matters more. We might think about it in terms of somebody's capital or their savings, right? You're going to steal from their savings, not from their day-to-day expenses or cash flow. So this is quite an interesting thing. He says that since the disposition and character are the seed from which actions spring, flatterers are perverting the very first principle of living. Why? Here we get to the next thing. They are investing vice with the names that belong to virtue. And we can call this euphemism, meaning speaking well of something. So they use euphemistic language to turn negative traits into positive ones. And Plutarch is going to give us lots of examples. Reckless daring, foolhardiness, came to be regarded as devoted courage. Watchful waiting as specious cowardice. Moderation as a craven's pretext, a keen understanding for everything, a want of energy to undertake anything. And he says we should be on our guard against prodigality, being a spendthrift, being called liberality or generosity, cowardice, self-preservation, impulsiveness, quickness, stinginess, frugality, the amorous person, compassionate and amiable, the irascible and overbearing, spirited, the insignificant and meek, kindly. There is a tendency to put a good face on bad qualities. Just as much of a problem in our own time as it was back then. He also talks about another technique that's closely related, which is even more pernicious, and that's praising, as he says, and fostering vices in a person by condemning, abusing, disparaging, and ridiculing their opposites. And their opposites could be another vice, but they could also be the virtue itself. So, he talks here about the people who are profligate, they're too willing to spend their resources. They condemn frugality, keeping an eye on your resources, as rusticity, being a backwards country person. Among avaricious evildoers whose wealth is gained from shameful and unscrupulous deeds, they condemn contented independence and honesty as the want of courage and vigor for active life. So what they're doing is they're taking the good trait that the person doesn't have, condemning it, so that the person who has a bad trait looks good by contrast to that. It's a rather convoluted form of praise, right? He says, often enough a way to flatter a public speaker is to disparage a philosopher. And we see that people doing this all the time. This person is so much more practical than these academics with their heads in the sky. I mean, if you actually know much about philosophy, you know that a lot of philosophy, including Plutarch, is very practical, even if it might have come from an academic source or something like that. But people will use language to flatter in this way, sometimes even flattering themselves because they aren't secure in who they are. So that's, how the parasite latches on. The last thing that we need to talk about is what he calls silent flattery, which is another form of praise. And people do this by, he says, pretending not to be praising, but instead doing something else, and this something else carries an interpretation, an implication of praising that person. So, how do people do this? He says that you can take a person who is talking and they surrender their speaking place to the other person, right? They make it plain that they regard the other person as their superior by doing that, as more worthy of being listened to. You can also do that by continuing to speak, but you give ground to, and then you come around to the other person's position. You're like, yeah, before I started this, I thought this was a good thing. Now I realize after hearing you, it's a bad thing. That makes the person who you're targeting with this speech act of yours feel like, oh yeah, they like me. They think that I'm smart, right? And you can even do this without having to say anything other than please sit by, as he says, taking up a seat, for example, in a place of entertainment or at a dinner party, and then deliberately yielding it to somebody else, saying, oh, you're more worthy than me to sit here. And this could just be powerful people, rich people, people who have prestige. The effect is to make it feel to them like you're saying, hey, you're a good person. And they will have a positive attitude towards you because of that. So, he says, here's a test for this. We must detect such cases of cringing submission and giving way on the basis of why the deference is being paid. Is it being paid to experience or virtue or age? Or is it to wealth and social status? So that's one way to identify this. So these are a number of different tricks and techniques that flatterers are going to use, which Plutarch examines, analyzes, tells us how to be on guard in this very important work. And why do we need to do that? Because the really good flattery is going to use tricks like this. It's not going to be so easy to discern as somebody just coming up and fawning on us and kissing our rear ends. We need to be on guard against these more subtle tricks.